During the afternoon of July 15, 2005, a summer getaway that was supposed to be among the Sullivan family's most joyous memories transformed into an enigma that would haunt them forever. Within a span of under 10 minutes, 3 young brothers vanished from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, as their parents struggled with an unexpected wind gust that blew their beach gear around. There were no prior warnings, no distinct witnesses, and no apparent clues left in their wake. At one instant, Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan were immersed in the typical noise and flow of a standard American beach outing. The following second, they were nowhere to be found. Hailing from Charlotte, North Carolina, the Sullivans had traveled there seeking a straightforward escape from their everyday routines. 35-year-old Andrew Sullivan was a diligent and dependable construction project manager who dedicated most of his year to juggling deadlines, financial plans, work sites, and household expenses. He was the sort of dad who felt that security was established day after day, not by making grand vows, but through hard work, tolerance, and a reliable presence. For the last 3 years, his 32-year-old wife, Rachel Sullivan, had dedicated herself entirely to bringing up their triplet boys. Ever since the children's birth in 2002, her daily life had been dictated by schedules, feedings, washing, doctor visits, clamor, and the continuous needs of 3 infants developing simultaneously. The 3 brothers were not identical triplets. However, to unfamiliar people, they appeared almost indistinguishable. They shared the same cheerful, youthful expressions, the identical gentle traits of early boyhood, and a similar type of smile that prompted passers-by to pause and remark whenever the whole family ventured out. Occasionally, even Andrew and Rachel had to take a closer glance when the children were darting rapidly about the home or chuckling in unison. Yet, their individual temperaments were distinct enough for their mother and father to recognize them profoundly. As the eldest, Noah was spirited and playful, consistently being the first to transform a mundane situation into a fun activity. The middle boy, Mason, was more reserved, highly observant, and frequently appeared to spot details before his siblings did. Caleb, being the youngest, trailed behind his brothers with absolute faith, bearing a joyful purity that established him as the emotional core of the trio. Leading up to the summer of 2005, Andrew and Rachel believed they deserved a brief getaway. Their existence in Charlotte was steady, though never simple. Having 3 toddlers meant that every single day necessitated organization, stamina, and tolerance. For them, Myrtle Beach was not an extravagant retreat. It was a sensible family excursion, the sort countless American households take when they desire the sea, reasonably priced meals, a motel room, and a few days where daily stress seems more distant. They showed up carrying beach towels, kids' outfits, treats, sunblock, plastic pails, and a silent wish that their boys would recall their initial true encounter with the Atlantic Ocean. That morning on July 15 commenced with the exact sort of joy Andrew and Rachel had hoped for. The children were thrilled by the ocean, captivated by the noise and rhythm of the shore, and fully engrossed in the liberty of a summertime day. Both parents remained nearby, vigilant in the manner that individuals raising 3 young kids must constantly be. The kids splashed in the shallow section near the water's edge, where other households congregated, and the shoreline seemed secure enough for a brief afternoon of family time. Not a single element of that day indicated any peril. The hour was not late. The location was not deserted. It was not an obscured area. It was a communal beach packed with families, holidaymakers, rescue personnel, and the typical bustle of summer travel. Near midday, the family paused their beach activities to dine at a laid-back seafood spot nearby. It was the sort of eatery prevalent along the South Carolina shoreline, featuring kids' meals, baskets of fried fish, sweet tea, and exhausted parents attempting to find one meal that suited everybody. Even that uncomplicated lunch seemed like a triumph to Andrew and Rachel. The youngsters were inquisitive about everything, particularly the strange dishes, and the concept that the sea was linked to the food people consumed. Specifically, Caleb appeared mesmerized by the seafood presented on the table. Meanwhile, Noah and Mason transformed the dining experience into yet another minor escapade. To an onlooker, they appeared to be a standard young household enjoying a typical American summer trip. Following their meal, the Sullivans headed back to the shore for the rest of the afternoon. Approaching 2 p.m., the youngsters were once more near the shallow waves, sufficiently close for Andrew and Rachel to monitor them from their resting place on the sand. The mother and father were merely about 30 feet distant. At that instant, there was absolutely no cause to suspect that such a distance posed any threat. Surrounding families were close by. The shoreline was expansive. The children stayed united. The afternoon still seemed like a completely normal day. Suddenly, the breeze shifted. An unexpected, forceful blast of air swept through the vicinity, tossing the family's meticulously organized beach gear into chaos. Blankets moved, light objects flew away, and the sunshade grew hard to control. Andrew and Rachel concentrated on preventing their possessions from tumbling across the sand into the areas of other beachgoers. It was the sort of minor inconvenience that any parent would recognize. Annoying, yet not alarming. The disruption endured for merely a few minutes. Under 10 minutes elapsed before their focus shifted completely back to the spot where their sons had been splashing. Noah, Mason, and Caleb were absent from that spot. Initially, the idea seemed too unbelievable to swallow. Andrew and Rachel assumed the children had merely wandered a short distance away, maybe heading toward another cluster of kids, perhaps stepping behind a neighboring family, or just slipping out of direct view. However, every passing moment made that rationalization flimsier. The boys' beach playthings remained untouched. Their belongings had not been stolen. Nobody in the vicinity could state definitively where the children had wandered. The shallow surf exhibited no evidence of a fight or an emergency. The children had not merely strolled back to the beach blankets. They were not discovered sitting with a different family. They had not wandered to the food kiosks, the car park, or the communal bathrooms. The typical noises of Myrtle Beach persisted all around them. Yet for Andrew and Rachel, time collapsed into one horrifying reality. Every single one of their 3 boys had disappeared simultaneously. At 10 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, Andrew dialed 911. In a matter of minutes, what started as a family holiday turned into a full-scale crisis. Noah Sullivan, Mason Sullivan, and Caleb Sullivan were reported to authorities as lost youngsters. Their ages, their attire, their physical descriptions, and the crucial fact that they were triplets were restated over and over. Rachel and Andrew plunged into a living nightmare no mother or father is ever equipped for, a terror intensified by the total absence of any definitive explanation. 3 young boys had vanished in the middle of the day from a bustling American shoreline. There lacked any verified observer to the exact second they went missing. There was zero instant proof indicating the direction they had taken. Consequently, on that July afternoon in 2005, the Sullivan family's existence fractured into 2 distinct eras. Everything that occurred prior to those 10 minutes, and everything that came afterward. The initial hours following Andrew's emergency call were saturated with panic, bewilderment, and an escalating dread that nobody on the sand knew how to articulate. Local law enforcement arrived promptly, joined shortly by beach guards and rescue workers. Given that 3 kids had vanished concurrently, the incident was handled as a critical emergency right from the start. The specific fact that rendered the crisis even more distressing was their young age. Noah, Mason, and Caleb were a mere 3 years old. They were incapable of traveling a long distance by themselves. They were unable to articulate their situation clearly to unknown adults. They could not vanish from a packed public coastline unless something compelled the surrounding environment to look the other way at the absolute worst second. The initial theory was that the children might have waded into the ocean and been dragged out deeper than anyone noticed. rescue teams initiated their hunt in the water because that presented the most immediate peril at any coastal location. Beach patrol and emergency crews surveyed the shallow zones initially, subsequently broadening the perimeter past the section of water where the toddlers had been splashing. The Coast Guard received notification, and the sweep expanded up and down the coast, yet almost right away, that hypothesis seemed incorrect to locals familiar with the terrain. The children had been amusing themselves in extremely shallow tide. The conditions had altered only momentarily due to the wind burst, but there were no hazardous waves, no powerful undertows reported in that precise spot, and not a single witness who observed 3 tiny kids being dragged out to sea. The alternative theory was that the brothers had strayed off as a group. Law enforcement initiated searches of the adjacent vicinity. This included local bathrooms, food stalls, parking garages, hotel doorways, boardwalk entry points, gaming centers, boutique stores, and family eateries along the busy tourist stretch. During the middle of July, Myrtle Beach was swarming with vacationers, which made the hunt simultaneously promising and arduous. A densely populated area implied someone could have witnessed a clue. However, it also signified that 3 little boys could easily be concealed by the normal flow of foot traffic for a few critical moments. Details regarding the triplets were relayed to everybody in the vicinity. 3 male toddlers, 3 years of age, matching descriptions, last spotted near the shallow tide. They were named Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan. They were traveling from Charlotte, North Carolina. They were finally observed while their mother and father were managing beach supplies blown around by a sudden burst of wind. The reality that they appeared so identical turned into the primary detail individuals recalled. Multiple vacationers verified observing 3 young brothers frolicking together earlier that same afternoon. A few recalled how rare and endearing it was to observe 3 toddlers who looked incredibly alike. Some recollected a young household attempting to juggle 3 little ones during a seaside outing. Yet not a single one of them could articulate what occurred during the specific minutes that truly counted. That total lack of an observer became the core of the enigma. As the late afternoon arrived, authorities had transitioned from a standard lost child procedure into a much more expansive inquiry. Detectives interrogated stall owners, resort staff, dining personnel, beach guards, groups sitting close to the Sullivans, and whoever had been present in that sector of the shore between 2:45 and 3:10 p.m. They inquired if anybody had noticed an unknown person talking to the toddlers, a car departing hastily, an individual holding a youngster, or 3 kids being led off. The responses they received were ambiguous, partial, and frequently unhelpful. Onlookers recalled the 3 brothers prior to their disappearance. Nobody recalled the vanishing act itself. The absence of video surveillance exacerbated the predicament. Back in 2005, Myrtle Beach maintained security lenses in certain shops and resorts, but not the sort of comprehensive public monitoring that would emerge as standard in subsequent years. A majority of the lenses were directed at doorways, payment registers, parking lots, or hotel reception areas. Very few captured the shoreline distinctly. Even after detectives gathered the accessible recordings, the resolution was subpar. The viewpoints were restricted, and the timestamps failed to offer a distinct route from the Sullivan family's sandy location to any recognizable spot. There existed no clear picture of the youngsters departing. There was no clear-cut person of interest. When dusk drew near, the incident circulated throughout regional media. A family getaway had morphed into a widespread crisis. Journalists started airing the names and photos of the absent triplets. Law enforcement urged anybody who had visited Myrtle Beach that afternoon to present themselves, particularly travelers who had snapped pictures or recorded personal videos. During 2005, numerous households still brought digital cameras or video recorders on their holidays. Detectives kept their fingers crossed that some peripheral shot might hold a trace of evidence. Even an unfocused snapshot of the toddlers, a stranger loitering nearby, or a car situated improperly might prove significant. That evening, The manhunt did not cease. Rescue crews pressed on with their efforts across the beachfront region. Notifications were dispatched to adjoining counties and police forces throughout South and North Carolina. Medical centers were alerted just in case nameless children were admitted. Transit terminals, cab companies, vehicle rental businesses, and state trooper divisions were all informed. Each passing hour rendered the situation more terrifying, given that 3 little ones could not endure for an extended period without assistance. Furthermore, if somebody had snatched them, the gap between the youngsters and the ocean was continually expanding. Come July 16, the search operation broadened immensely. Helpers showed up after viewing the television reports. Congregations, resident households, resort workers, and tourists pitched in to help the coordinated search campaigns. Handbills surfaced, displaying the children's faces and names. Nationwide child protection agencies were brought into the loop. Authorities maintained every theory as viable, yet every single one contained flaws. Had the toddlers drowned, there ought to have been a trace. Had they strolled away, somebody ought to have located them. Had they been kidnapped, somebody ought to have spotted 3 kids being snatched from a communal beach during daylight. However, nothing made sense. For Andrew and Rachel, the following day proved even more agonizing than the initial one, as initial shock started giving way to powerless anticipation. They had stepped onto the sand as guardians handling a challenging yet joyful afternoon with 3 little ones. Currently, they were parents reciting details of their boys to unknown people, responding to identical inquiries repeatedly, and observing trained searchers scour locations where no child materialized. They were denied the solace of a single definitive rationale. Every potential outcome was horrifying, and every hour lacking updates made each theory increasingly difficult to endure. Come the 3rd day, the hunt had encompassed the shoreline, adjacent roads, shops, parking zones, and stretches of the coast well past the initial spot. Leads trickled in, yet none pointed to Noah, Mason, or Caleb. Certain individuals phoning in believed they had spotted 3 youngsters inside a van. Others recollected a male behaving suspiciously. A few notified authorities of kids bearing a resemblance in a different town. Detectives pursued whatever they were able to, yet the investigation remained hollow at its center. There existed 3 vanished boys, a 10-minute window, and a shoreline packed with individuals who had observed them living but had failed to witness them disappear. Inside of a week, the narrative expanded past Myrtle Beach. Area broadcasters reported on it. Publications published the family's pictures. The incident became a topic of conversation in neighborhoods all over the Carolinas. Mothers and fathers nationwide grasped the terror instantly because the environment was so incredibly mundane. It did not occur in a secluded side street or a derelict structure. It transpired during a family holiday in the dead of day, at a location where countless parents had relied on the environment being secure enough for a brief few minutes. Nevertheless, societal focus behaved as societal focus frequently does. It surged rapidly, then started to wane when no fresh solutions emerged. Different offenses showed up in the headlines. Different crises claimed the spotlight. The Sullivan trio stayed lost, yet the nation's attention shifted elsewhere. Andrew and Rachel were incapable of shifting their attention. To them, the inquiry did not turn into an outdated tale. It transformed into the very framework of their existence. Andrew took a leave from his employment to pursue clues, converse with detectives, talk to anybody asserting they possessed information, and journey whenever a potential sighting surfaced. Rachel reached out to lost child advocacy groups, medical centers, refuges, congregations, adoption bureaus, and police departments across state borders. She discovered how swiftly optimism could turn into agony. However, she also realized that giving up felt completely unfeasible. As the first year drew to a close, the formal hunt had decelerated. Assets were restricted. Fresh clues had failed to materialize. Detectives maintained the file as active, but the immediate daily pressure diminished. To external observers, The vanishing of Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan was transitioning into a stagnant mystery. For their mother and father, it stayed the identical afternoon, July 15th, 2005, Myrtle Beach, an unexpected blast of wind, under 10 minutes, and 3 young brothers who never returned. By the year 2006, the vanishing of Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan had progressed into a distinct and more brutal phase. The initial frantic weeks had been packed with patrol vehicles, rescue squads, telephone calls, interrogations, broadcast crews, posters, and pressing vows that every clue would be investigated. Yet following months devoid of proof, the probe could no longer proceed with equal momentum. Myrtle Beach law enforcement continued to leave the file open. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children continued to feature the brothers. Their pictures still showed up in lost child registries. Still, the everyday mechanics of the investigation started to lag. For Andrew and Rachel Sullivan, absolutely nothing lagged. Their boys remained 3 years of age in their thoughts. Each dawn commenced with the identical unbearable dilemma: where were they currently? Each dusk concluded with the identical unresolved dread: had somebody nourished them, shielded them, or referred to them by their actual names? The remainder of society discussed the incident as an event in the past. For Andrew and Rachel, it was continuously occurring. It occurred each instance the telephone chimed. It occurred every instance an unfamiliar person in a supermarket stared a bit too long at one of the wanted flyers. It occurred each July when summer arrived again, and households loaded vehicles for coastal getaways as though the universe could still be relied upon. During 2006, authorities officially scaled back the ongoing probe since no fresh concrete proof had surfaced. The choice was pragmatic, grounded in restricted funds, dead-end leads, and the lack of material evidence. To the Sullivan household, it seemed like yet another bereavement. The brothers had previously disappeared from the shoreline. Presently, it seemed as though they were gradually fading from formal priority as well. Andrew was incapable of tolerating that. He repeatedly took time off from his job before finally resigning from his role entirely. Building sites demanded physical attendance, strict schedules, and an uncluttered mind. He possessed none of those attributes anymore. He commenced journeying any time a viable clue surfaced. A tip from South Carolina, a text from Georgia, an account from Tennessee, a kid spotted in a religious sanctuary in Florida. He chased down whatever seemed even slightly plausible. Several clues originated from well-intentioned individuals who sincerely thought they had spotted one of the youngsters. Additional ones originated from individuals who were bewildered, isolated, or seeking spotlight. Andrew figured out how to distinguish the disparity, yet he still investigated as frequently as he was able, because the price of disregarding the correct tip felt too heavy to bear. Rachel adopted a separate route, yet her existence grew equally engrossed. She affiliated with parental networks tied to lost youth, figured out how to collaborate with charitable groups, and started establishing bonds with mums and dads who understood the identical type of anticipation. Via these connections, she acquired the jargon of age-advanced portraits, file digits, police liaisons, youth protection branches, and press continuations. She mailed bundles of data to safe houses, children's clinics, adoption branches, educational zones, religious centers, and regional police bureaus spanning several states. She retained duplicates of the children's birth records, previous pictures, health specifics, and every conceivable distinguishing trait from their toddler years. The initial significant misleading optimism surfaced in the spring of 2007. An orphanage in Atlanta reached out to officials after taking in a little boy who seemed to be roughly 4 years of age. He possessed scarce details regarding his origins, and a facility worker believed his visage shared traits with the age-progressed visuals tied to the Sullivan inquiry. The notification got to Andrew and Rachel swiftly. It was not offered as a sure thing, merely a potentiality, yet potentiality was sufficient to reorganize their entire universe for a single day. They journeyed to Georgia, telling themselves they needed to remain guarded, yet incapable of fending off optimism. The child's years appeared accurate. His history was vague. The notion that one of their boys might have been deserted, located, and put into the system had persistently been among the theories they secretly harbored. It was agonizing, yet it simultaneously signified survival. If one boy had made it to an orphanage, maybe the others had as well. The genetic testing terminated that optimism. The youngster in Atlanta was neither Noah, Mason, nor Caleb. The outcome was definitive, yet the psychological toll was ongoing. Andrew and Rachel headed back to Charlotte with yet another label eliminated, yet another avenue blocked off, yet another prompt that the globe was packed with kids requiring assistance, yet not one of them was their offspring. They could not fault the orphanage, they could not fault the individual who had phoned. Everybody had behaved out of care. However, care did not render the letdown any simpler to endure. Following Atlanta, comparable notifications persisted throughout the years. A youth in Tennessee who looked like Mason. A kid in the Florida foster system who lacked a definitive birth record. A potential spot at a rural medical center in Kentucky. A youth in a religious initiative who had formerly utilized the moniker Caleb. Every clue bore just a sufficient amount of specifics to turn excruciating. Every single one compelled Andrew and Rachel to envision the identical reunion once more. One boy located, one fragment of the household repaired, one solution following years of quiet. Every single one concluded in the identical manner: zero correspondence, zero link, zero homecoming. Around 2010, individuals surrounding the Sullivans started uttering statements they believed were empathetic. They advised Andrew and Rachel that existence could not stay paused indefinitely. They proposed bereavement therapy, relocating to a fresh residence, resuming employment, launching a charity, taking in a new child, or even trying for another infant if that remained viable. A few expressed these remarks softly. Others stated them because they felt uneasy around a sorrow that lacked an expiration date. Nobody intended malice, yet the majority of individuals failed to grasp that Andrew and Rachel were not rejecting life. They were declining to substitute their children. Rachel remained particularly resolute. Noah, Mason, and Caleb were not recollections to be boxed away. They were her offspring. Up until there existed evidence that they were lost permanently, she would persist in trusting they could be surviving someplace. That conviction did not render her days any smoother. It merely provided her with a motivation to proceed. Andrew bore the identical conviction, yet his remorse assumed a distinct form. He continuously drifted back to the 10-minute window at Myrtle Beach. Inside his head, the entire mystery perpetually condensed into that single instant. The breeze, the dispersed items, the temporary diversion, the vacant void where the children had stood. He rewound it repeatedly, not because it exposed any fresh details, but since retribution can turn comforting when a resolution is absent. Rachel harbored her personal variation of the identical remorse. She questioned if she ought to have held the children nearer, if she ought to have dismissed the objects blowing off, or if some intuition should have alerted her before reality shifted. They abstained from explicitly blaming one another. That formed a portion of what rendered the agony more silent and more oppressive. The guilt shifted internally. It resided underneath mundane phrasing. It rested between them throughout festivities, natal days, and milestones. It trailed them into each and every July. Subsequently, in 2012, a different tip arrived. This specific one originated from Richmond, Virginia. An educational director had grown conscious of a youth around 10 years of age, possessing a convoluted past and sparse recollection of his toddler years. He had been absorbed into the youth care network years prior, with fragmented files, and an individual knowledgeable about lost child files spotted a similarity to one of the Sullivan brothers. The years aligned, the absent initial recollections aligned, The ambiguity surrounding his beginnings aligned. For the initial moment in years, Rachel sensed the familiar conviction resurface, the intuition that this could not be coincidental. Andrew attempted to stay wary, yet the specifics were tough to dismiss. By that time, Noah, Mason, and Caleb would have reached approximately 10 years of age, a youth discovered years prior lacking a dependable background, existing beneath a different moniker. It aligned with the sort of obscured route detectives had pondered frequently. Rachel permitted herself to envision that if even merely one of the children had been located, it would unlock the pathway to the others. They traveled to Virginia. The youth was polite, bewildered by the focus, and visibly bearing his own arduous past. Rachel desperately wished for him to be one of her offspring. For a fleeting span, every part of her appeared to align itself around that prospect, yet the genetic test returned adverse. Once more, the response was negative. That letdown hit in a different way. Due to the youth's older years, it compelled Andrew and Rachel to face just how much time had elapsed. They were not hunting for 3 infants anymore. They were hunting for youth mature enough to attend classes, youth who could possess fresh identities, fresh households, fresh recollections, or zero recollections at all. Their boys might be maturing without realizing they were lost. Following the collapse of the Richmond tip, the Sullivans grew more silent, yet no less resolute. Societal focus had dwindled. The media seldom referenced the incident, unless a yearly milestone loomed. A few locals ceased inquiring, since they were unsure of what to utter. Companions wandered off into their personal existences. Society continued generating commencements, trips, marriages, natal days, and standard household pictures. Andrew and Rachel figured out how to exist alongside those events without completely participating in them. During 2015, a decade following the vanishing, the file was formally handled as a dormant case. That categorization did not indicate it was shut, yet it signified detectives possessed no ongoing avenue to pursue. An investigator informed Rachel that fresh proof would reinitiate the dossier instantly. She clung to that phrase with the gravity of a vow. A decade had elapsed since Myrtle Beach. The brothers would have reached 13. The pictures on the flyers no longer corresponded to the youth they might have developed into. Their tones, hobbies, anxieties, and aspirations remained foreign to the mother and father, who adored them deeply. Nevertheless, Rachel maintained the records neatly arranged. Andrew continued responding to phone calls. Each July 15, they drifted back mentally to the identical 10 minutes. By that point, optimism no longer seemed radiant. It felt exhausted, obstinate, and vital. It lacked the effortless optimism of individuals anticipating positive tidings. It was the arduous optimism of guardians who had been let down far too frequently to remain naive, yet who still refused to permit the universe to obliterate the identities of Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan. Approaching 2015, a full 10 years had drifted by since Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan vanished from Myrtle Beach. The file was not shut, yet it had arrived at the stage every lost child's relatives dread. It became formally designated as a dormant investigation. To the detectives, this implied there existed no current clue robust enough to advance. To Andrew and Rachel, this meant society was requesting them to accept quietness, as though quietness served as a resolution. The investigator tasked with analyzing the dossier assured Rachel that the incident would never be discarded. Should fresh proof emerge, should an observer present themselves, should a youth's background be challenged, should any specific link back to July 15, 2005, the record would be unsealed once more. Rachel paid close attention since she required those phrases to carry weight. She had previously discovered that bureaucracies progressed much simpler than parents could. A law enforcement precinct might rotate its staff. A broadcast channel might cease reporting on a narrative. A neighborhood might recall the event solely during yearly milestones. However, a mum was not allowed to pack her kids away in a vault alongside old documents. By that era, the children would have reached 13 years of age. That reality altered the method Rachel used to hunt. She ceased analyzing solely the visages of infants in refuges or youth welfare bulletins. She was forced to visualize junior high youths, longer visages, altered pitches, fresh monikers, diverse hairstyles, and unknown existences. The pictures from 2005 remained the core of the investigation, yet they failed to align with the current reality. Age-advanced portraits turned essential, and Rachel figured out how to rely upon them, despite the fact that each variant stung in a distinct manner. Every portrait represented both optimism and bereavement, an endeavor to visualize youth she had been denied the chance to observe maturing. Andrew stayed engaged, yet the passage of time had rendered him more silent. He continued responding to phone calls from detectives. He continued journeying whenever a clue appeared substantial. He continued retaining duplicates of investigation documents and phone digits. Yet optimism had morphed into something the pair managed warily. They had been incorrect an excessive number of times. A similarity could ruin an entire week. A telephone ring could tear open an old scar. A genetic finding could dump them right back at the start, bearing the tragic past of a different youth while failing to locate their own. During 2020, Noah, Mason, and Caleb would have reached 18. That landmark shifted Rachel's sorrow once more. They were not merely lost kids anymore. They were lawfully grown-ups in some location. Assuming they were surviving, they might be employed, learning, operating vehicles, leasing an apartment, seeking careers, forming friendships, romancing, casting ballots, and constructing existences beneath names she was completely unaware of. They could possess absolutely zero clue that their birthplace was Charlotte. They could lack any recollection of Myrtle Beach. They could be unaware that they possessed siblings. They might have been fed an entirely fabricated narrative regarding their true identities. That notion turned entirely unignorable for Rachel. As the global outbreak threw normal existence into disarray throughout 2020 and 2021, Rachel discovered herself dedicating more hours to the internet. Initially, it served a pragmatic purpose. Numerous bureaus became tougher to contact, physical gatherings were called off, and lost youth support networks shifted a larger portion of their efforts to digital spaces. Subsequently, she started grasping what the web had evolved into since the year 2005. During the calendar year her boys vanished, digital networking had not factored into the hunt in the manner it currently did. There existed handbills, regional broadcasts, law enforcement notices, and registry entries. Fast forward to 2021, a solitary upload could be circulated nationwide within mere hours. A clip might access unknown individuals in territories she had never set foot in. A visage might be viewed by thousands of individuals lacking any tie to the initial incident. Rachel educated herself on how to navigate Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, not for amusement, but as instruments. She crafted uploads featuring the siblings' names: Noah Sullivan, Mason Sullivan, Caleb Sullivan. She attached the specific day, July 15, 2005. She attached the exact site, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She shared the initial youth pictures alongside the age-advanced visuals. She penned brief descriptions detailing that the trio had vanished during a holiday getaway when they were merely 3 years old. She utilized taglines linked to lost youth, dormant files, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and triplets. Initially, the reaction was minimal. Acquaintances forwarded the uploads. Several unknown individuals dropped comments of encouragement. A handful of individuals vowed to remain vigilant. Different users forwarded potential clues that failed to withstand scrutiny. Rachel figured out how to review every single text attentively without yielding her emotions to it excessively fast. The web delivered expansive access, yet it simultaneously delivered chaos. Individuals confused similarity with proof. A few circulated narratives without verifying the details. A handful handled the incident as an enigma to debate rather than a household trauma that remained unhealed. Nevertheless, Rachel continued publishing throughout the year 2022. She persisted in expanding the digital footprint surrounding the file. She re-uploaded the siblings' visuals during their natal days. She published on the milestone of their vanishing. She jogged people's memories that, assuming the brothers were surviving, they would currently be young adults. She requested anybody who had been raised in the welfare system, anybody with ambiguous adoption files, or anybody who possessed unexplainable voids in their early youth recollections, to contemplate the chance that their background might be flawed. Absolutely nothing materialized. By the dawn of 2023, Rachel had become accustomed to letdowns in a virtual format too. Her uploads traveled vastly further than paper notices ever managed, yet geographical spread did not instantly generate solutions. Subsequently, on the dusk of March 15, 2023, the initial genuine breakthrough surfaced in the most mundane manner conceivable. Rachel was swiping through Instagram when a culinary clip popped up on her timeline. The profile was owned by a youthful cook, recognized on the web as Coastal Kel. He had grown famous for blending Southern comfort cuisine with contemporary instructions, particularly ocean-based meals and family-oriented platters influenced by the Carolina shoreline. His clips were inviting, refined, and effortless to view. It was the sort of media people bookmarked for evening meal inspiration, or forwarded because it carried a personal touch without being overly emotional. Rachel, however, wasn't paying attention to the meals. The youth featured in the clip was stated to be 21 years of age. His actual identity remained hidden from the public eye. According to his bio, he resided in Charleston, South Carolina, was raised within the foster system, and was a self-taught chef who eventually made a living out of internet clips. These facts by themselves would have been sufficient to make Rachel stop and think. Yet, it was his countenance that truly captivated her. There was a certain quality to his grin that pulled her directly into yesteryear. It wasn't merely a vague similarity, nor the sort of likeness frantic mothers and fathers might conjure up if they yearned to trust it desperately enough. It was a distinct sense of recognition. The manner in which his features shifted when he beamed, the contours framing his eyes, and the geniality that brought to mind Caleb as a little boy. Over the decades, Rachel had observed numerous youngsters and young adult males who bore a slight resemblance to her missing children. This instance appeared unique. She tracked down additional clips of his. She viewed earlier uploads, brief videos, culinary preambles, dialogues, and everyday life updates. As she watched more, it grew increasingly difficult to brush off. Coastal Cal was 21 years old. Caleb would also be 21. Coastal Cal possessed no distinct recollections of his beginnings. Caleb had gone missing at 3 years old. Coastal Cal had been raised within the South Carolina foster network. Caleb had vanished from a shoreline in South Carolina. Rachel presented the profile to Andrew. He recognized the similarity as well, yet years of pursuing dead ends had instilled a nearly reflexive cautiousness in him. He pointed out to Rachel that they required solid evidence, not merely a matching countenance. Rachel comprehended this. She had no desire to confuse optimism with hard evidence once more, yet she also recognized that certain clues only transform into facts because an individual possesses the bravery to pose that initial query. A few days following that, Rachel stumbled upon an older clip that made the prospect even tougher to disregard. Coastal Cal had recorded a culinary feature tied to Myrtle Beach. Within that footage, he noted that the location gave him an odd sense of familiarity, despite lacking any obvious justification for such an emotion. He characterized the shoreline as a place that appeared linked to a recollection he couldn't quite grasp. To Rachel, this was no longer a matter she could simply drop. She transmitted a message to him cautiously, devoid of any accusations, and avoiding making excessive declarations. She presented herself as a follower of his culinary content and mentioned that his Myrtle Beach broadcast had deeply affected her. She inquired if he possessed any private ties to the region or if he had ever discovered any details concerning his earliest childhood years. The response wasn't immediate, But upon its arrival, it altered the course of the subsequent phase in the Sullivan investigation. Coastal Cal typed that he held no memories prior to about 4 years of age. He mentioned he had grown up inside the foster network, noting that his childhood files were lacking, and he had never been acquainted with his birth mother and father. He had perpetually been informed that he was discovered as a small youngster, and subsequently shifted throughout the South Carolina child welfare framework. He remained unaware of his birthplace. He was clueless about the identity bestowed upon him at delivery. He had no idea if he possessed any brothers or sisters. Rachel absorbed the text as a parent who had spent 18 years anticipating a single tiny crack in a sealed entryway. It wasn't concrete evidence. It wasn't a definitive resolution just yet. However, for the initial time in a long while, the prospect lying before her wasn't founded solely on visual similarities. It possessed a matching age, it featured a vacant history, it pointed to South Carolina. Moreover, it involved a young adult whose visage bore far too strong a resemblance to Caleb Sullivan to brush aside. Rachel refrained from sending a follow-up text instantly. Following 18 years of misguided clues, she comprehended the peril of anticipation when it surfaced too rapidly. Coastal Cal's age aligned perfectly. His absent early memories fit the puzzle. His tie to South Carolina was a match. His countenance bore an undeniable something that Rachel couldn't rationalize away. Nevertheless, none of this constituted absolute proof. A parent's intuition had sustained her through almost 2 decades of hunting, yet she recognized that society would not take intuition as factual proof. Furthermore, she couldn't demand that a young man with an ambiguous background shoulder the burden of her sorrow carelessly. For several days, she and Andrew scrutinized every piece of information they held. They observed additional videos from Coastal Cal. They measured his facial traits against vintage pictures of Caleb. They verified the chronology repeatedly. Caleb had gone missing at 3 years old, in July of 2005. Coastal Cal claimed he lacked any recollections prior to about age 4. He had been raised in the South Carolina child welfare circuit. He turned 21 in 2023. His online presence did not specify biological relatives, a birth city, or an established origin story. These particulars didn't guarantee he was Caleb, but they constructed the most compelling lead the Sullivans had encountered in years. Andrew stayed guarded. He had discovered that physical likenesses could deceive mourning mothers and fathers. He had witnessed Rachel agonize following every incorrect youth, every unsuccessful genetic screening, and every tip that ultimately belonged to someone else's narrative. Yet, even Andrew couldn't dispute that this prospect felt unique. It wasn't solely about the visage. It was the blank background accompanying that visage. It was the manner in which Coastal Cal had discussed Myrtle Beach, as though the location was tethered to a recollection he couldn't access. It was how the chronology fit together seamlessly, without any manipulation. Rachel ultimately reached out to him once more. She refrained from declaring herself as his parent. She didn't dictate what he ought to think. She detailed that she had been hunting for her lost boy for 18 years, that her son Caleb had vanished from Myrtle Beach in 2005 alongside his 2 siblings, and that Caleb would presently share his age. She informed him that specific elements of his background felt significant, particularly the absent childhood recollections and the duration he had lingered in the foster system. She inquired if he would be open to a gathering, not to coerce him, but because a genetic evaluation could grant the reality to the both of them. The communication hovered between the two of them like a concept too massive for plain vocabulary. Coastal Cal's official identity was Calvin Brooks. He had forged his internet persona around cuisine because preparing meals was the initial aspect of his existence that truly felt exclusively his own. Being raised in the foster system had instructed him to avoid relying overly much on any single definition of a household. Certain arrangements had been acceptable, others had been fleeting. Some individuals had handled him kindly, yet it never came with a sense of forever. By the time he reached adulthood, he had figured out how to summarize his history. in brief, tidy statements, discovered young, missing documentation, child welfare, independent culinary learner, relocated to Charleston, amassed an internet audience. This narrative was less burdensome to tote around than the complete reality, since the entire truth perpetually contained an inquiry nobody could address. Who was he prior to becoming Calvin Brooks? Rachel's communication disrupted that inquiry in a manner he was unable to brush off. He was aware of lost youth narratives. He recognized that individuals sometimes learned later in life that they were taken in, left behind, or disconnected from their relatives. However, being informed that he could be one of 3 siblings snatched from a shoreline in 2005 seemed almost unfathomable. It rang like an element from a true crime special, not a detail linked to his personal existence. Nevertheless, the identities lingered in his mind. Noah, Mason, Caleb, particularly Caleb. He looked up the investigation on the internet. The news pieces were aged, but they were legitimate. The pictures were authentic. The timelines were accurate. 3 identical brothers from Charlotte had vanished from Myrtle Beach on the 15th of July 2005. Their mother and father were Andrew and Rachel Sullivan. The littlest one was called Caleb. The mystery had remained open. Calvin stared at the early life pictures for an extended period. He couldn't recall being the youngster depicted in them. He had no memory of Andrew or Rachel. He couldn't remember possessing 2 siblings. Yet, a certain aspect of those photographs didn't feel as remote as ancient news stories typically did. The likeness existed, and the absence of memory made it tougher to ignore. He consented to an encounter. On the 10th of April 2023, Rachel and Andrew convened with Calvin in Charleston. The gathering was organized meticulously, devoid of press, lacking public scrutiny, and without anybody feigning absolute certainty before scientific results could be heard. Rachel carried duplicates of the vintage photos, the case particulars, and the age-advance portraits that had been generated throughout the decades. Andrew carried the cautious hesitance of a dad who yearned to trust it, but dreaded the impact another error would inflict upon everyone concerned. For Calvin, the encounter proved intensely overwhelming right from the start. He was accustomed to individuals identifying him from culinary clips, not from a youth he was unable to remember. Rachel and Andrew refrained from handling him like an unknown entity, yet they likewise didn't impose a forced closeness upon him. That dynamic rendered the scenario challenging in a unique manner. Their optimism was cautious, yet it was distinctly evident. Their sorrow had resided alongside them for 18 long years, and currently, a portion of it had assumed the form of an inquiry seated directly opposite him. The pictures sparked no abrupt recollections. Calvin scrutinized the visages of the 3 tiny boys, the informal family photos, and the shots taken prior to the vanishing. He recognized likenesses, but lacked absolute conviction. He didn't experience the intense flood of familiarity that folks conjure up in tales. What he experienced was bewilderment, stress, and a peculiar melancholy for individuals who had endured such immense loss, regardless of whether he was truly theirs. Rachel comprehended this. She hadn't anticipated an obliterated life to flood back within a single sitting. Caleb had been merely 3 years old when he disappeared. Had he been terrified, ill, shuffled from location to location, and subsequently raised under a different alias, his recollections likely wouldn't have endured in any distinct manner. The sole objective resolution would arrive via DNA. They mutually decided to undergo the testing. The period separating the encounter and the outcome felt far more stretched out than the preceding years, albeit in a distinctive fashion. For 18 years, Rachel and Andrew had endured an ambiguity draped across decades. Presently, that ambiguity carried a time limit. A clinic outcome would either shut down this prospect permanently or alter the entire narrative of their household. Calvin attempted to carry on with his job, yet the inquiry shadowed him into every facet of his existence. Should the outcome be negative, he would revert to being Calvin Brooks, a youthful culinary artist with an absent origin story and no distinct biological narrative. Should it be positive, then his existence had been constructed upon a moniker assigned subsequent to the forfeiture of a different one. He would possess a mother and father, he would have siblings, he would have lived as a lost youth without being aware of it. On the 15th of April 2023, the genetic testing outcome was returned. The correlation was indisputable. Calvin Brooks was indeed Caleb Sullivan. The statistical likelihood validated what Rachel had intuited from that very first clip. The youthful cook, recognized on the web as Coastal Cal, was the youngest member of the Sullivan triplets, who had vanished from Myrtle Beach 18 years prior. The toddler who had gone missing at 3 years old had endured, been raised under a different persona, and unwittingly made his way back to his mum via an Instagram culinary post. The reality did not manifest as mere joy. It was accompanied by astonishment, solace, sorrow, incredulity, and the instant burden of all the details that remained unresolved. Rachel and Andrew had located one boy, yet they also discovered that he had lived almost his whole existence, completely unaware of his true identity. Caleb had located his mother and father, yet he had also discovered that his youth was initiated by an offense he couldn't recall. Andrew and Rachel eased Caleb back into the narrative of his own existence as tenderly as they managed. They presented him with the domestic pictures from Charlotte, the portraits of the 3 siblings united, the premature birth anniversary photos, the documents they had safeguarded, and the lost child notices that had broadcasted his identity for 18 years. Caleb recalled very little of it. At certain points, particular names appeared to awaken a faint sensation, yet nothing coalesced into a distinct recollection. The most monumental inquiry persisted. Where exactly were Noah and Mason? Caleb held no memory of being raised alongside brothers. He possessed no recollection of being snatched from Myrtle Beach. His initial genuine memories originated from the child welfare system in South Carolina, around 4 years of age. He recalled being informed that he had been discovered lacking any dependable ID. He recalled migrating through various foster homes, discovering how to respond to Calvin Brooks, and slowly coming to terms with the fact that his early existence was a mystery no grown-up could clarify. The validation of his identity compelled law enforcement to revive the Sullivan file with fresh desperation. This was no longer merely a dormant file, founded upon lost youngsters and unresolved hypotheses. One of the vanished boys had been discovered breathing. That signified the initial presumption had to be altered. The youngsters had not merely drowned in the sea. Caleb had been removed from Myrtle Beach and subsequently turned up within the South Carolina child welfare framework, utilizing a different persona. Detectives commenced hunting for the earliest documented file tied to Calvin Brooks. The paperwork pointed back to Charleston in July of 2005. A little boy, judged to be roughly 3 or 4 years of age, had been discovered intensely sick and lacking any identification. His earliest files were sketchy, and since his visage and physical state had rendered recognition hard, nobody had linked him to the missing triplets from Myrtle Beach. Back then, authorities had presumed that if the Sullivan youths were located, they would probably remain united. The concept that a single youngster could be discarded independently, while the others were transported elsewhere, hadn't evolved into the primary hypothesis. Presently, it stood as the sole hypothesis that proved logical. Caleb's reappearance granted Rachel and Andrew the blessing they had petitioned for. Yet, it additionally revealed a more profound terror. If Caleb was discarded due to his illness, then Noah and Mason might have stayed with the individuals who kidnapped them. They might have been bartered, given new identities, unlawfully adopted, or transported across state borders. They could potentially be alive currently, entirely unaware of their real names. For the initial time in 18 years, the Sullivan household possessed evidence that a single son lived, and that evidence transformed into the essential element for locating the other two. Following the confirmation of Caleb's identity, the Sullivan investigation transformed practically overnight. For 18 years, authorities had been laboring with nothingness. 3 vanished boys, no verified path, no identified perpetrator, and no confirmed survival. Currently, there existed one living boy, one validated genetic correlation, and one undeniable reality that reconstructed everything. Caleb Sullivan hadn't perished at Myrtle Beach. He had been taken from that shoreline, divided from his siblings, and subsequently joined the child welfare circuit in South Carolina under the alias Calvin Brooks. That solitary fact compelled detectives to reconstruct the initial 7 days following the kidnapping from the very start. The revitalized inquiry centered upon the tight time frame between July 15th and July 19th of 2005. If Caleb emerged in Charleston mere days after disappearing from Myrtle Beach, then somebody had transported him through South Carolina. That signified that transit logs, crisis dispatches, child welfare intake documents, medical center registries, transit terminal memos, private security footage logs, and vintage police records all carried weight once more. What once appeared to be disjointed paperwork presently needed to be interpreted as elements of a single concealed journey. The FBI entered the investigation because the clues pointed to a potential child kidnapping that traversed county borders, possibly state borders, and might have entailed an illicit adoption syndicate. Local authorities in Myrtle Beach collaborated with departments in Charleston, Charlotte, Raleigh, and additional municipalities linked to prior leads. The investigation remained challenging since 18 years had slipped by. Staff members had stepped down, files had been sent to storage. Certain establishments no longer operated. Surveillance devices from that era were long discarded. However, Caleb's genetic material provided the inquiry with something it never previously possessed: a biological cornerstone. Detectives revisited the most ancient document linked to Calvin Brooks. During July of 2005, a little boy assessed to be 3 or 4 years of age was discovered in Charleston, lacking trustworthy ID. He had been gravely ill, incapable of supplying a distinct name, and far too little to articulate what had transpired. His physical state and the lack of comprehensive details prompted officials to manage him as an unknown child, requiring supervision. Back then, nobody linked him to the vanished Sullivan triplets, since the general storyline focused on 3 youngsters disappearing jointly from Myrtle Beach. The thought that one might be discarded individually while the remaining 2 were hauled to a different location had not been entirely grasped. Currently, that oversight proved agonizing and pivotal. The subsequent phase involved determining how Caleb arrived in Charleston. Detectives scrutinized vintage transit information from the dates right after the kidnapping. The majority of the logs were lacking, yet a single record popped out. On the 16th of July 2005, 2 grown-ups and 3 tiny boys acquired coach fares from the vicinity of Myrtle Beach, heading towards Charleston, utilizing aliases that subsequently seemed questionable. The fares had been settled with physical currency. The ID details provided were scarce and, governed by the norms of that era, hadn't sparked any alarm. That particular detail could easily have been brushed aside decades before. Presently, it appeared vital. A former worker linked to the transit terminal was tracked down and questioned. His recollection wasn't flawless after such a long time, but he recalled a party that had appeared out of the ordinary. 2 grown-ups journeying with 3 tiny youngsters who appeared remarkably similar. He recollected that the kids hadn't appeared calm, and one among them seemed unwell throughout the journey. At that moment, he lacked any cause to link the group to a massive missing youth investigation. Households passed through Myrtle Beach routinely during the summertime. Kids wept. Mothers and fathers appeared exhausted. There was nothing about it that demanded meddling. To Rachel and Andrew, this intelligence served as both validation and torture. Their boys were likely still united the afternoon following their abduction. There existed a specific time frame somewhere between Myrtle Beach and Charleston when all 3 brothers were living near each other and still in proximity to the existence that had been snatched away from them. Yet, nobody recognized who they were. Nobody halted the grown-ups accompanying them. Nobody grasped that three vanished kids were navigating through standard public networks under illegitimate supervision. Authorities theorized that Caleb grew too ill for the kidnappers to handle. That clarified why he was discarded in Charleston and eventually joined the foster care network. However, the inquiry presently grew significantly more pressing. What occurred to Noah and Mason after Caleb was abandoned? Caleb's genetic blueprint was inputted into the relevant law enforcement and lost individual matching databases since he was authenticated as the natural offspring of Andrew and Rachel Sullivan. His genetic code could be utilized to hunt for full brothers. Authorities additionally reached out to placement bureaus, child welfare divisions, independent family law practices, and older foster care archives throughout the Carolinas and adjacent territories. They hunted for youngsters around 3 years of age who joined independent placements or casual guardianship setups during the summer or autumn of 2005, possessing lacking or dubious documentation. Under a week later, a substantial correlation emerged out of Raleigh, North Carolina. A 21-year-old male going by the name of Ryan Mitchell had formerly provided his DNA as an element of an individual genealogical hunt. When evaluated via the correct pathways, his genetic blueprint exhibited a sibling tier link to Caleb Sullivan. The correlation was potent enough to mandate an instant follow-up. Ryan Mitchell had been raised in Raleigh alongside Thomas and Karen Mitchell, a pair who had legally claimed him in 2005. They held a reputable standing in their neighborhood and had reared him with steadiness, schooling, and affection. Based on their narrative, they had desired a kid for years and were guided to a private placement setup via a middleman. They were informed the youngster was roughly 3 years of age, possessed no accessible family members, and hailed from a tough background. The documents they were handed appeared adequate to them back then, even though subsequent scrutiny revealed discrepancies. Ryan's childhood recollections were spotty. He had been raised understanding he was taken in, yet lacking the complete reality behind his placement. During his youth, he occasionally recited names that resembled Mason and Caleb. His mum and dad had deduced those identities belonged to fabricated companions, kids from a prior home, or shattered pieces of a tough origin. There had never been sufficient context to link those identities to a missing triplet mystery from Myrtle Beach. The genetic outcome altered all that. Ryan Mitchell was, in fact, Noah Sullivan. This revelation handed Andrew and Rachel their second boy back, yet it simultaneously intensified the tragedy of what had transpired. Noah had been breathing this entire time, residing beneath a different alias just a few hours from his birthplace. In contrast to Caleb, he had been raised inside a secure household. Thomas and Karen Mitchell had not realized they were entwined in an offense. They had operated under the assumption that they were aiding a youth who required a household. Their sorrow and disbelief turned into a portion of the expanding destruction generated by the individuals who had snatched the youngsters. Noah's existence in Raleigh had been abundant in manners his natural parents were appreciative of. Even amid the sorrow, he had blossomed into a university pupil majoring in computer science. He remained robust, dependable, and cherished by the relatives who brought him up. Yet, much like Caleb, he had lugged around an unclarified void. He had never been capable of rationalizing the identities that surfaced in his youth, or the feeling that his placement narrative commenced far too late, as though the initial chapters of his existence had been torn out. Following Noah's identification, authorities shifted their focus to the placement middleman. The identity recorded in the Mitchell family's vintage documents did not trace back to a lawful bureau. The location had become invalid years prior. The telephone line was out of service. Numerous papers seemed to have been forged to appear legitimate without navigating the correct lawful pathways. The individual who orchestrated Noah's integration had comprehended how to take advantage of households desperate to take in a child and frameworks that weren't corresponding adequately enough during 2005. The track appeared weak until June of 2023, when a fresh and unanticipated lead surfaced out of Baltimore, Maryland. A junior high pupil had joined an optional genetic testing initiative linked to a genealogical medical project. The outcomes displayed a tight biological tie to the Sullivan family tree, yet the youngster was merely 14 years of age. He couldn't possibly be Mason. He couldn't be one of the vanished triplets. His age was incorrect, yet the tie was genuine. Authorities scrutinized the familial connection and discovered that the genetic link did not point to the youth as one of the vanished youngsters, but rather gestured toward his dad. For the initial time, the inquiry had transitioned past the missing youngsters and toward a potential grown-up tied to the offense itself. The identity tethered to that familial file was Gregory Walsh, an individual whose background held fake names, private placement liaisons, and links to casual child integration setups spanning multiple states. By the conclusion of that phase of the inquiry, a couple of the Sullivan brothers had been located breathing. Caleb had made his way back via a culinary clip and a genetic evaluation. Noah had been unearthed via genetic cross-referencing and a placement file that had concealed the reality for 18 years. Solely Mason stayed absent, and currently, for the initial time, authorities possessed an identity that could clarify who had kidnapped them. The revelation linked to Baltimore morphed the inquiry from a hunt for missing boys into a chase for the individuals who had stolen them. Up to that juncture, the file had been constructed from scattered fragments: Caleb's lacking child welfare file, Noah's dubious placement documentation, vintage transit specifics, and the recollection of two grown-ups journeying with three similarly featured youngsters following the vanishing. Every element hinted at an offense, yet the perpetrator behind it stayed shielded behind fake identities and flawed documents. Gregory Walsh turned into the initial identity that remained solid under scrutiny. On documents, he seemed to be a normal individual with a household in Maryland. Yet when authorities began tracking his history, the normal exterior shattered swiftly. Gregory had utilized numerous fake names. He had shifted among several states up and down the eastern seaboard. His identity, or variations of identities linked to him, surfaced alongside independent placement agreements that were never handled via authorized bureaus. Certain households recalled him as a supportive intermediary who was acquainted with folks in child welfare. Others recollected him as an individual who could handle dilemmas discreetly for pairs who desired youngsters but dreaded lengthy lawful wait lines. By June of 2023, the FBI and regional detectives gathered sufficient evidence to pull him in for questioning. The proof wasn't constructed upon a single piece of paper. It resulted from the piling up of files that ought to have never linked up. The 2005 transit route, originating from Myrtle Beach, the fake intermediary connected to Noah's placement in Raleigh, the unresolved emergence of Caleb in Charleston, and the biological tie via Gregory's personal relatives. It was no longer feasible for authorities to handle him as a mere fluke. Gregory rejected everything initially. He asserted he had operated purely as a casual recommendation liaison, that households had approached him since the placement network was sluggish and costly, and that he had never kidnapped a youth. He stated that older documents were chaotic since folks were sloppy back in 2005. He declared he was unacquainted with Andrew and Rachel Sullivan, had never played a part in the vanishing at Myrtle Beach, and held no link to Noah, Mason, or Caleb. However, the detectives had dedicated weeks to reconstructing the concealed route of the three kids. They possessed the transit fare sequence. They held the chronology. They possessed Noah's placement documents, which incorporated a fake contact connected to one of Gregory's aliases. They held statements from a household that had formerly handed cash to an independent middleman. They held proof that Gregory had collaborated with a female going by the name of Marsha Reed, who had likewise surfaced in dubious integration cases during the mid-2000s. The deeper he rejected it, the closer every denial planted him to the core of the file. Marsha Reed evolved into the second primary character in the inquiry. She had previously portrayed herself as a youth integration assistant, an individual who was acquainted with frantic youthful mums, stressed relatives, and kids who required households. In truth, she had aided in shifting youngsters outside of lawful pathways. A few had originated from at-risk households, a few had hailed from ambiguous histories, and in the most dreadful instances, authorities suspected youngsters had been blatantly snatched, given new names, and bartered into independent setups masked as legal integration. During interrogation, Gregory's narrative started to crumble. He initially conceded to knowing Marcia. Following that, he confessed to coordinating independent integrations. Then he admitted that certain documents had been fabricated. Ultimately, when faced with the Sullivan chronology and the genetic evidence, he admitted to the offense that had tormented Andrew and Rachel for 18 years. On the 15th of July 2005, Gregory Walsh and Marcia Reed had been present at Myrtle Beach. They had been observing households, hunting for youngsters who could be snatched swiftly and relocated before a warning could spread excessively far. The Sullivan triplets caught their eye since they were little, looked alike, and were easy to remember. Gregory subsequently confessed that the precise quality making the boys precious to their mum and dad rendered them lucrative to individuals like himself. 3 siblings could be divided and bartered off to disparate households. Their identical age and look would render them highly sought after to particular illicit purchasers, specifically households who desired little kids and were prepared to overlook inquiries. When the breeze disturbed the Sullivan household's shoreline arrangement, Gregory and Marcia seized the opportunity. The kids were merely 3 years old. They were trusting, disoriented, and simple to steer away from the spot where they had been amusing themselves. In a matter of minutes, the 3 brothers were taken from the shoreline and positioned inside a transport. The strategy was to shift them away from Myrtle Beach before authorities could set up barricades or warnings. The initial stop was Charleston. From that point, Gregory and Marcia planned to divide the kids and link each youngster to a distinct illicit placement. However, Caleb fell perilously ill during the journey. Gregory confessed the youngster's temperature spiked rapidly, and he dreaded Caleb would pass away before they could execute the strategy. A deceased youngster would attract scrutiny, law enforcement, medical centers, and an entirely different tier of criminal accusation. Therefore, they discarded Caleb in a spot where someone would ultimately discover him. They didn't execute this out of compassion. They executed it to safeguard themselves. That was exactly how Caleb joined the South Carolina Child Welfare Framework as an unknown kid. He morphed into Calvin Brooks since nobody was aware he was Caleb Sullivan. Noah was transported next. Gregory coordinated his integration with Thomas and Karen Mitchell in Raleigh via fake paperwork and an independent monetary exchange. The Mitchells had operated under the assumption that they were taking in a kid whose history was sorrowful but lawful. They possessed zero clue. The youngster they relabeled Ryan Mitchell was one of the vanished Sullivan triplets. Gregory had depended upon the psychological fragility of a pair who desired a kid, and the loopholes in monitoring that allowed unregistered middlemen to function in the dark. Mason's trajectory proved to be the final and most difficult to unravel. Gregory confessed that Mason had been dispatched to Norfolk, Virginia, to a pair who had additionally handed over money via an illicit integration. The pair had absorbed him utilizing a different identity, trusting, or opting to trust, that the setup was permissible. However, in 2010, when Mason was roughly 8 years of age, that pair perished in an automobile crash. Lacking any properly logged placement background and possessing no distinct biological relatives on file, Mason was injected into Virginia's child welfare network. From that moment on, his existence grew unstable. He was shifted through numerous residences and centers. Certain stays extended for months, others wrapped up swiftly. Identities shifted on documents, academic records altered, social workers switched out. The kid who had formerly been Mason Sullivan morphed into Adrian Cole within the framework, a youth possessing an incomplete background, a shielded record, and recollections no grown-up grasped how to decode. By the period authorities located him in 2023, Adrian was residing in Richmond. He was 21, employed at a vehicle fixing shop, and attending night courses to construct a vocational profession. In contrast to Caleb and Noah, he hadn't been raised possessing a secure identity. His early life had been disrupted repeatedly, initially by kidnapping, subsequently by illicit integration, then by the passing of the individuals who had taken him in, and finally by decades spent inside frameworks that were entirely unaware of his genuine identity. The genetic screening validated what Gregory's admission had disclosed. Adrian Cole was indeed Mason Sullivan. Among the three siblings, Mason bore the most shattered pieces from the afternoon that altered everything. He didn't possess an entire recollection. He was unable to account for every single hour following Myrtle Beach, but he retained a sense of terror linked to moving around. He recollected being divided from two youngsters who felt like a piece of his own being. He recalled identities that had lingered with him even when grown-ups brushed them off as juvenile bewilderment: Noah, Caleb. Occasionally he had spoken them aloud in foster residences. Occasionally he had scribbled them down without comprehending the reason. Nobody had ever linked those identities to an actual investigation. When Andrew and Rachel were informed Mason had been located, the solace was nearly too massive to grasp. They had already reclaimed Caleb. They had tracked down Noah. But Mason's narrative bore a distinct kind of sorrow, because his years had proven to be the most severe. Caleb had been raised amid ambiguity, but eventually constructed an existence via the culinary arts. Noah had been reared by an affectionate household that had been tricked. Mason had navigated through continuous sorrow, constantly unaware that a pair of parents and two siblings had been hunting for him the whole duration. The inquiry expanded subsequent to Gregory's admission. Officials commenced scrutinizing older independent adoptions, missing youth files, and questionable child welfare logs spanning multiple states. Gregory Walsh and Marcia Reed were not handled as lone transgressors. Clues indicated they had functioned as elements of a broader illicit syndicate that had taken advantage of frantic adopting households, flimsy documentation, and at-risk kids for decades. However, for the Sullivan household, the legal prosecution, although significant, no longer served as the sole core of the narrative. For the primary time since the 15th of July 2005, all three boys were breathing and accounted for. Their identities had been reinstated: Noah Sullivan, Mason Sullivan, and Caleb Sullivan. The unaddressed inquiry that had dominated 18 years of Andrew and Rachel's existence finally possessed a resolution. Their kids hadn't simply disappeared from the earth. They had been kidnapped, relabeled, divided, and concealed within standard societal frameworks that failed to spot them. And currently, following 18 years, the final sibling had been located. On the 15th of July 2023, precisely 18 years following the afternoon Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan vanished from Myrtle Beach, the Sullivan household journeyed back to the location where their existence had been shattered apart. This round, Andrew and Rachel weren't traveling back carrying handouts, law enforcement contacts, age-advanced portraits, or an additional petition for society to recall their kids. They returned carrying all three of their breathing boys. They weren't 3-year-old toddlers anymore. They were 21-year-old adult males, each bearing a distinct identity, originating from the existence that had been thrust upon him, each bearing recollections molded by unknown individuals, networks, absent files, and unaddressed questions. Caleb had existed as Calvin Brooks, the youthful culinary artist recognized on the internet as Coastal Cal, constructing an existence from cuisine, rigor, and the silent urge to fashion something that resembled a household. Noah had existed as Ryan Mitchell, reared in Raleigh by claiming parents who cherished him and remained entirely unaware of the reality behind the documents they had relied upon. Mason had existed as Adrian Cole, shifting through the child welfare network following consecutive tragedies, enduring volatility with fewer safeguards than either of his siblings had obtained. To Andrew and Rachel, observing the three of them united did not wipe away the 18 years that had been snatched. It did not restore birth anniversaries, academic mornings, misplaced baby teeth, youth baseball matches, domestic evening meals, commencement ceremonies, or the intimate everyday occasions that mothers and fathers construct their existence around. It didn't reverse the decades when Rachel scrutinized the visages of unknown individuals on the web, pondering if one among them could be her boy. It didn't reverse the decades when Andrew pursued fruitless hints across state boundaries, penalizing himself for 10 minutes he could never alter. Yet it granted them a thing they had dreaded they might never obtain. It granted them the opportunity to become acquainted with their kids as grown men. The coming together wasn't straightforward in the manner folks frequently picture such gatherings to be. Gratitude existed, yet there was additionally astonishment. Solace existed, yet likewise sorrow. Caleb, Noah, and Mason had to discover how to function as siblings once more, following being raised inside distinct realities. They had to grasp the identities their mum and dad had bestowed upon them, and figure out how those identities sat alongside the aliases they had lugged around for 18 years. Caleb remained Calvin to numerous individuals who cherished him. Noah maintained an attachment to the Mitchell household, who had raised him with careful attention. Mason retained the files and emotional wounds of a network that had never comprehended what had genuinely transpired with him. Andrew and Rachel grasped that locating their boys did not grant them the privilege to dictate that history become straightforward. They couldn't request Caleb to cease being the individual he had evolved into in Charleston. They couldn't request Noah to pivot away from Thomas and Karen Mitchell, who had been tricked, yet had supplied him with a secure upbringing. They couldn't request Mason to recover more rapidly than existence had allowed him to be hurt. The sole item they could supply was the reality, a household that had never ceased hunting, and a location where every boy could fit in without being compelled to delete the existence that preceded it. During the weeks subsequent to the coming together, the Sullivan residence transformed into a gathering spot for individuals whose existences had been altered by the identical offense in disparate manners. Thomas and Karen Mitchell had to confront the crushing truth that their taking in of a child had commenced with another household's agony. They collaborated entirely with authorities and stayed a component of Noah's existence, not as stand-ins for Andrew and Rachel, but as individuals who had cared for him purely inside a falsehood they hadn't forged. Caleb continued to operate as a culinary artist, yet his internet persona shifted. His audience had recognized him as an affectionate, gifted, youthful cook. Presently they discovered that his existence had additionally functioned as a lost youngster mystery concealed right out in the open. Mason commenced obtaining assistance that had never been accessible to him prior: familial backing, legal representation, therapy, and aid in reconstructing the paperwork of his existence. The legal prosecution advanced, carrying nationwide scrutiny. Gregory Walsh, Marsha Reed, and additional individuals connected to the illicit child integration syndicate were indicted for their parts in kidnapping, smuggling, deception, and fabricating placement-linked files. Authorities unearthed proof that the Sullivan brothers were not the solely impacted youngsters. For decades, individuals akin to Gregory and Marsha had exploited frantic households, at-risk kids, flimsy documents, and loopholes separating state departments. They had concealed brutality behind the terminology of placement and prospect. They had handled youngsters as dilemmas to be shifted, identities to be altered, and existences to be bartered. The Sullivan file prompted uneasy inquiries all across the nation. Just how many youngsters had navigated through independent agreements lacking correct monitoring? Just how many households had relied upon documents that were never lawful? Just how many grown-ups were existing with absent segments in their histories simply because nobody had connected the correct files at the exact moment? The resolutions did not emerge rapidly, but the investigation rendered silence tougher to justify. By the year 2024, the Sullivan household was still in the process of recovering. Recovering did not signify going back to the existence they led before July 15, 2005. That existence no longer survived. Recovering signified forging something genuine out of what was left. It signified Andrew discovering how to communicate with his boys as grown men, while concurrently mourning the toddlers he misplaced. It signified Rachel discovering that maternity could persist even following decades of vacancy, not by acting as though the vacancy hadn't transpired, but by rejecting to let it dictate their total tomorrow. Caleb continued to cook. A few of his clips grew more subdued and more intimate, concentrating on dishes linked to household, recollection, and another opportunity. He didn't morph his agony into a spectacle, yet he let folks comprehend that cuisine had been his method of constructing solace when he remained unaware of his origins. Noah headed back to his studies and grew fascinated by tech that could aid in pinpointing lost individuals and relinking households divided by flawed files. He had existed for decades alongside an affectionate family and an incomplete reality. Presently, he desired frameworks to become superior for the subsequent youngster. Mason carried on striving towards self-sufficiency, yet this round he wasn't forced to tackle it solely. He possessed siblings who grasped segments of him that nobody else could. He possessed a mum and dad who had hunted for him well before he even realized he was missing. Rachel maintained the digital platform she had formerly utilized to hunt for her boys. It no longer broadcasted merely frantic updates and vintage pictures. It transformed into a destination for additional households to transmit narratives, inquiries, and appeals for aid. Rachel never guaranteed magical resolutions. She grasped far too deeply that not every single vanished individual file concludes with a gathering. Yet, she additionally recognized that an investigation can appear hopeless and still not be finished. She recognized that a lone clip, a solitary genetic screening, a single individual, prepared to pose one additional query, could unlock an entryway that had appeared locked for decades. The identities Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan were ultimately reinstated, not as symbols tucked inside a dormant file, but as breathing individuals possessing tomorrows still ahead of them. Their gathering did not render the offense any less horrid. It did not render the decades any less agonizing. But it demonstrated that even when the reality lies buried beneath fake names, shattered frameworks, and the passage of time itself, it can still surface when somebody declines to cease hunting. The Sullivan household's narrative evolved into something greater than a tale regarding sorrow. It morphed into a cue that affection isn't perpetually boisterous, theatrical, or simple to spot from the exterior. Occasionally, affection is a mum grasping fresh tech because the previous methods fell short. Occasionally, it is a dad responding to one additional telephone ring following 100 letdowns. Occasionally, it is a youthful male consenting to a genetic evaluation, even if the reality might alter everything. Occasionally, it is three siblings opting to reconstruct a tie that was snatched away from them prior to them being mature enough to comprehend it. There exist injuries that no gathering can completely seal. There exist decades that no tribunal can give back. However, there additionally exists a variant of optimism that endures lacking any assurances. It doesn't rely upon society taking notice. It doesn't vanish when the broadcasts shift focus. It lingers, hunts, educates itself, and makes another attempt. And occasionally, following 18 years of quiet, that optimism transforms into the pathway back. I extend my sincere gratitude to you for allocating the time to hear today's narrative. Your focus holds more value than you might comprehend, since narratives akin to this are not solely regarding sorrow, enigma, or coming together. They prompt us to remember the muted resilience that resides within everyday individuals when existence hands them a weight that no household ought to ever be forced to tote. The Sullivan household's expedition instructs us that affection doesn't conclude when resolutions vanish. Optimism might grow exhausted, challenged, and nearly unseen, yet it can still endure, spanning decades of quiet. A mum's tenacity, a dad's rejection of surrender, and the bravery of three kids to confront the reality demonstrate to us that recovery is achievable, even after history has snatched so much away. This narrative likewise cues us to pay heed to the individuals situated around us. In some place, somebody might be anticipating a text, a recollection, a tiny hint, or an instance of compassion that possesses the power to alter everything. Occasionally the reality is uncovered not within a single massive wonder, but within the choice to carry on hunting for just one more sunrise. Should this narrative have moved your soul, we would be profoundly appreciative of your backing. Kindly thumbs up this clip, distribute your reflections within the remarks section beneath, and register for our channel. Your backing aids us in continuing to deliver significant, moving, and uplifting narratives to a larger audience. I appreciate your presence, and may every narrative prompt us to remember that compassion, optimism, and affection continually hold weight.